Welcome to another movie story. Today we will watch an amazing sci-fi, romance, drama film from 2016. Movie name is Passengers. At the start of the movie we see an interstellar spaceship named Avalon traveling through space. Its destination is a colonized world called Homestead 2. The vessel is on autopilot, all of its quarters are empty. The 258 crew members and the 5,000 passengers all are in hibernation. Suddenly, the ship detects an asteroid belt on its path ahead. Power is diverted to the main frontal shield, but the ship is on a collision course with a giant asteroid. Finding no alternative route, the asteroid collides with the ship, causing various damage. Ship's automated self-reparation starts, but one of the hibernation pods malfunctions and activates. The passenger awakened is Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer. His pod begins an automated system to assist with his awakening, telling him that he has spent 120 years in the hibernation state, and the ship is only 4 months away from Homestead 2. He's told that he will be able to spend that remaining time enjoying the luxurious facilities of the ship. Finishing the health check, she helps Jim reach his cabin. She gives instructions about his ID band, and the primary day-to-day activities, prior to the arrival on the planet. Next morning, excited and nervous to meet the people, he gets ready, leaves his cabin and walks into an automated class. Jim looks a little anxious, as he is the only person in this room. The hologram explains the situation on Earth, calling it overpopulated, overpriced and overrated. Jim asks her why he's the only one there. But she tells him to hold his questions to the end of the lesson. He realizes that the hologram can't answer him and goes to search for other people. He gets to the main concourse of the ship. An automated informational AI offers to help. Jim asks to talk to a real person and it sends him off to level 3 steward desk, but when he finds that it's empty there as well, he asks to speak to the captain. Bridge needs special access to go inside, but he can see from the door window that none of the main crew is awake either. Jim eventually goes to the observatory, where he finds out that the ship is actually 90 years away from Homestead 2. He realizes that he woke up too soon, so he rushes back to the concourse and sends a message back to Earth asking what he should do, because he doesn't know how to get back into hibernation. The communication system informs him that the expensive call to Earth would take 19 years to reach Earth and 55 years to get a reply. Jim is devastated. He walks around and finds the ship's bar, where he sees another person. He gets so delighted seeing another face. But talking to the bartender something seems strange. Jim realizes that he's an android. It's called Arthur. Jim asks Arthur about hibernation pod, but he malfunctions a little, explaining the existence of Jim here ahead of time. Next morning Jim goes to the canteen, where he finds out that most of the things on the menu are reserved for gold-class passengers only. He gets his plain coffee and tries to figure out how to fix his hibernation chamber. After he gets all the tools, he manages to get it operating and lies down inside of the pod. But nothing happens. Next, he tries to open the crew's hibernation chambers with everything he got. But he fails there as well. Small malfunctions happen around the ship. He keeps returning to the bar to drink, but mostly to talk to Arthur. Jim decides to have some fun, so he breaks into one of the gold-class suite. Jim tries all the restaurants, the games, the entertainment system. But as time passes he becomes even more miserable to be there alone. One day, he gets drunk and wanders around the hibernation pods among sleeping people. He finds a room with spacesuits designed for spacewalks. Jim gets into a suit and goes to the airlock, pushes a lever and then the button to open the airlock door. Once outside the ship he's mesmerized by the view. He stares at the vast emptiness. Jim releases the magnets on his boots and floats in space. Experiencing the most amazing feeling, yet none to share it with. This feeling of loneliness has thrown him to the edge. He comes back inside devastated. But again goes back to the airlock without his suit on. He pulls the lever, ready to end it all, but changes his mind in the last moment, runs back inside and slips on a bottle. Jim stands up and is instantly drawn to a sleeping woman in the pod in front of him. Her name is Aurora. He looks for her files in the directory and listens to her passenger interview. He becomes fascinated with her. He sits next to her pod, still listening to her interviews. He's reading some of her work and is talking to Arthur about her writing. Going another planet for a better life, waking up midway and not getting there, and finding this perfect woman, only for her to be out of reach. Jim becomes obsessed with the irony of his situation. He keeps thinking about her and eventually an idea settles in his head, waking her up too. He is too confused to differ the right and wrong. He talks with Arthur but leaves the facts. If he wakes her up for his own benefit, he'd be stranding her there with him, to die on the ship. Jim holds himself back, he can't stop thinking about her. Until one day, he changes his mind. He stands beside her pod holding a bag of tools, and then activate her pod. As she's waking up and going through the same process as he did, he hides and runs back to his room. A little bit later he slowly enters the main concourse. She is there standing, just as confused as he was a year ago. Jim tells her they're the only ones awake and takes her to the observatory. Then he shows her the crew hibernation room. Aurora freaks out and wants to get back into her pod. Jim explains that there is no special equipment on the ship that can help them get back into hibernation. He tells her to take rest since she has just waked up. She looks at him and says that more than a year alone in this ship must be hard for him. Jim says that it was. Jim goes back to the bar, feeling regrets for what he did. He asks Arthur not to tell Aurora that he was the one that woke her up. The next day, Aurora wakes up. On the concourse she asks the automated info AI about the hibernation pods. Jim invites her to breakfast. As they leave, the info AI has some sort of malfunction. In the canteen, Aurora finds out that Jim has been eating the same breakfast for more than a year and gets him one of the gold-class menus. Aurora isn't ready to give up. She talks about the possibility to fix the hibernation pods. She searches through the infirmary, then goes through research documents, and eventually tries to break the doors at the crew's hibernation quarters. Jim notices more malfunctions happening around. Time goes by, Aurora becoming more and more aware of her situation. She writes, jogs around the ship and swims in the pool, gradually accepting her life on Avalon. She interviews Jim about the story behind his joining this planetary migration. Eventually Jim opens up, back on Earth when something breaks, it is not fixed rather replaced. He hopes that on the new world he could build a home, and live on it. Later, they end up in the observatory and Aurora finally shares her reason to be there. Unlike the other passengers on the ship, she has a round-trip ticket. Her idea was to go to Homestead 2, live there for a year and come back to Earth, to become the first journalist that has ever done that, writing the greatest story that ever was. Aurora begins to give up and Jim figures out a way to cheer her up. He takes her dancing, to the cinema, and to the basketball court. Finally, he takes her to the bar to meet Arthur. She relaxes for a bit, until she remembers her situation, her smile fades away and leaves saying goodnight. Jim begins to feel awful about what he's done to her. The next moment he's seen tinkering with something and in the other Aurora walks into the observatory to find a miniature of the Chrysler building he made for her. He sends a letter asking her for dinner. They go on a date. At the bar they share stories about their lives. She tells him that her father died when she was a teenager. After the dinner, Jim takes Aurora to the airlock and they get into the spacesuits. They go out the airlock door. Jim finally has someone to share that magnificent experience with. Jim holds her hand and switches off the magnets on their boots. Slow they float together into the space. They come back inside and immediately kiss, return to his cabin and sleep together. Soon after, they start living like a couple. Aurora moves into his cabin and writes about her life on the ship. They jog together, eat together, sleep together. Jim explores the ship further and finds the hydroponics bay. He brings Aurora flowers. One day the ship passes by a red giant star Arcturus. They see it from the observatory. It's Aurora's birthday. Later that night they celebrated in one of the many fancy restaurants and then the bar. In conversation Aurora says Arthur that there is no secret between Jim and her. And Jim confirms it. In the washroom Jim looks at the ring that he made for Aurora, while she stays in the bar. Arthur talks about Jim's conversation about Aurora, that he waited month to meet her. Aurora finds out that from the pod Jim woke her up. Suddenly, Jim comes back and she confronts him in absolute disbelief. She runs away furious and panicked. Jim comes back to his cabin and all her things are gone. He runs into her in the canteen the next day, but the moment he speaks, she leaves. Aurora is desperate. One night she goes over to Jim's cabin, punching and kicking him, wanting to kill him. He doesn't resist. Jim talks to her over the comm because she keeps avoiding him. Jim tries to apologize for his actions to her. He tells her he fell in love with her, but Aurora doesn't care. She can't forgive him for taking her life. One night another major malfunction happens. The ship faces a critical error and the main command shuts down. Aurora can't move from what happened. She walks into the main concourse and sees that Jim has planted a tree there. Then, she goes to the canteen, where the food server starts malfunctioning. At the same time Jim was in an elevator and it malfunctions too. Suddenly, both of them hears a voice over the general comms, asking who planted a tree on his ship. They both run into the concourse and see the deck chief Gus Mancuso standing in front of Jim's tree. They introduce themselves and tell the chief about the situation. He doesn't understand how 3 pods could fail. Mancuso takes them to the bridge and tries to find out what's wrong with the ship, but all the automated logs are missing. They have to be checked manually. Malfunctions keep happening and the two of them tell Mancuso that it's been happening all over the ship more frequently. He says that shouldn't happen. He shows them how to collect the data and leaves to checks on the pods. He's figured out what happened with Aurora's pod and asks if Aurora knows. Later, at the bridge he's checking the collected data. Aurora talks about what happened with her pod, and that Jim murdered her. Jim walks in with the 16th broken robot. Mancuso feels the hibernation sickness, so he goes to rest, but as he walks out, he coughs out blood. That night, Aurora can't sleep, so she goes for a swim. Suddenly there's gravity malfunction throughout the ship and she starts drowning as the water rises with her. The gravity drive resets and she barely makes it out alive. They both run into each other going to find Mancuso. The three of them are back at the bridge, analyzing the data. Mancuso figures out that something happened 2 years ago that affected a major system. They need to find and fix the cause soon. Otherwise the entire ship will be stranded. They go to find the problem, but Mancuso faints, so Jim and Aurora take him to the infirmary. He's dying and there are no treatments that can stop it. Some time later, the three of them meet in the observatory and Mancuso gives Jim his ID bracelet, tells them to fix the ship and immediately passes away. Suddenly, the lights change to an alarming red and the ship starts shaking. Jim tells Aurora that he needs her help and they run. But another gravity failure struck. And immediately another one that afflicts Arthur as well. Jim deactivates him. They finally reach the main engineering and start looking for the problem. They find it in the power plant and as they open the hatch, Aurora gets sucked in. The asteroid has caused a breach in the hull in that area. Jim is trying to keep the door open while it keeps closing on him. Eventually they manage to seal the breach. Then Jim realizes that there is more than one breach in the hull. One of them has hit the reactor control computer. It has been trying to keep up ever since. Jim looks for replacement parts for it. They find the part and change it, but the process of venting the reactor still fails. Jim figures out that he needs to open the vent door from outside of the ship, so they can cool the reactor down. Both of them go to the airlock and Jim gets ready to go out. He gives Aurora Mancuso's bracelet, because he might not come back. She helps him with the suit and as he walks into the airlock she tells him to come back because she can't live on the ship without him. Aurora goes back to the reactor, where the temperature has hit critical heights. A detached bolt from the reactor hits her arm, as Jim is getting closer to the vent from the outside and sees the door. The temperature keeps rising in the reactor room, while he is trying to bypass the vent door to open it. He succeeds but it won't stay open. He soon realizes that he'll have to manually hold the door open and he tells Aurora. She disagrees the plan as she doesn't want him to die. He tells her to save the 5,000 other people on the ship. Having no other way she pulls the lever. The venting process is successful, but the force from the reactor pushed Jim away and break his tether. The pressure in his suit is dropping too. He tells Aurora what happened and she moves as fast as she can to get to another suit and bring him in. He apologizes to her again. She puts on a suit and goes out to get him, but her tether is not long enough. She's pulled back, but luckily she sees his tether and quickly grabs onto it. Aurora drags Jim into the infirmary, only to find out that he's already dead. She uses Mancuso's bracelet to override the medical protocols to resuscitate him. The infirmary begins automatic procedures. Jim slowly breaths and Aurora forgives him. Later, Aurora fixes Arthur and they give Mancuso a proper space burial. Jim takes her to the infirmary and tells her that he's found a way to keep the medical pod in a hibernation state. He tells her to get inside the pod and says farewell. But, as is later revealed, she decides to stay with him, awake on the ship. Jim finally proposes to her. They live out their lives on the ship sharing every moment to each other. 88 years later, the Avalon arrives on its destination Homestead 2. The crew wakes up and finds a surprising sight. Aurora leaves them a message, the story of an amazing life Jim and her had shared together while all were sleeping. Thank you for watching.